meeting with young people one-on-one here in town about this. Are we Jews supposed to believe in Hashem, or are we dafka not supposed to believe? Now, what do I mean when I say that? You know, the world has 8 billion people, more now. Everyone believes, and a lot of them are passionate. So the Risham in Gaza, who are killing themselves to kill us, believe. So to go ahead and say, I simply believe because my mother told him to believe, or because my religious leader told me to believe, it's not going to get you very far. I mean, it will, but the world is full of billions of people like that. So believing is dangerous. So if you're teaching your kids, or you yourself are brushing Yiddish guy saying, well, I was taught by my Rabbi, and I know my Rabbi is my Rabbi. The guy blowing himself in Benghazi was also taught by his mullah, and his mullah is his mullah. So, what makes us better? What is the base for us knowing that we have something solid and imparting that to our kids? And it's really the Aseres Adibros in this week's Parsha. So it's really a starting point on how you view the first mitzvah of Anochi Hashem Elokecha. A lot of Rishonim, like the Rambam, say it's a mitzvah. There's a mitzvah to have a relationship with Kadosh Baruch Hu. But the Rambam, if you look really carefully at his words, right, the Rambam he was a scientist, and his writing reflects that. He was very scientific. The Rambam never talks about believing in Hashem. He does not believe there's a mitzvah to believe in Hashem. Does anyone know how the Rambam codifies the mitzvah? The language that the Rambam uses when he describes the mitzvah that talks about a relationship with the Kadosh Baruch Hu? Never talks about emunah. Das. Talks about wisdom. What's the difference between wisdom and belief?
Wisdom or tibur. One is certainty, one is...
Das. And certainty, okay. And I like the idea you developed, but let's work with this.
From the Rambam?
Well, let's go there in a moment. Let's put the animals aside, because we have... over-prepared. I prepared this for, not just for our group, but there's 8 pages there. We're not going to go through all of this. Hand this around. A lot of them are secular sources, actually. But the Rambam, you'll see, talks about knowledge, scientific knowledge, empirical evidence. The Rambam believes, he was a scientist, that you can find evidence that God exists, you can find evidence that the Torah is true, and you can find evidence that the Jewish people have a relationship with the Kadosh Baruch Hu, and a specific role to play. And that's what our relationship is supposed to be based on. Empirical evidence, knowledge, scientific stuff. And the Rambam's language... So, where they do that in our Sameach. And I'm not saying that you have to sit down with your little kids who are growing up from an environment and start going through this, because that sometimes might complicate things that aren't complicated. If they're growing up in a solid, firm environment and things are simple and clear, maybe leave things be. That's a discussion. But certainly, people who are coming from the outside, or people who have dealings with the outside, it's something they should think about. And I want you to look at the Rambam's language. Okay, the first 2 Rambams on the sheet, okay? I've given this lecture at different places, so there's a title I give this lecture, The Death of God. We'll talk about that in a moment. It's a strange title, but there's a book called The Death of God. It's actually a good book. It's a pro-religious book, because I'm older than most of you, but I don't remember 1960, because I was born after 1960. But in the 50s and 60s, religion wasn't fashionable. It's actually much more fashionable to be religious now. The percentage of people that are religious is much higher. Percentage of Jews in Israel is markedly higher. It increases every year. Jews are much more religious than they were 30, 40, 50 years ago. They're actually much more religious in Israel now than they were in Poland before the war. So the movement is towards religion. But in the early 20th century, the mid-20th century, the movement was away from religion. So much so that Time magazine, do people even know what Time magazine is? Or it's over bottle, but we do. Just think the young guys don't, right? The cover of the magazine in 1960 was, Is God Dead? That was the cover of the magazine. You remember? You heard of it. And that became a discussion. Jews, Christians were moving away from religion. So there is a book that was written by a Christian, but a devout Christian, who is actually a professor of theology at Oxford University, top university in the world, right? And the title of his book is The Death of God, which means the idea that God of dead isn't palatable anymore. People are religious. Right. Okay, so it's the title is a little bit of a shocker, but it's a positive title. It's about the death of God. I mean, you got to believe in God. Like, how,
It's a double negative, so God is alive.
Right. So people are becoming more religious. But I want to start with the Rambam. Starting point is the Rambam in both. You saw the Torah in a number of places, as you pointed out correctly. Look at 1 and 2, where the Rambam tells us. You saw the Yisro of the Chachma, the foundation of everything religious, and the base for Chachma, Leida, to know sheyesh shematzui, to know that there's a power that exists. Now, what HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants of us, he wants us to be Jewish or Christian, that's a separate discussion. And that too can be proven, that he wants us to be Jewish. But that there is a God, the Rambam says, that's something that is something you know, not something you believe. Because if you just believe, it's something that you can prove. Now we'll discuss in a moment that you can prove it. But the Rambam says, you know, if you're a scientist, anyone here work in science? Well, you work in science, right? Anyone work with math or science? Anyone?
Electrician, so it's definitely math.
Same thing, right? So you prove things, right? 2 + 2. You work with things, right? So and if it doesn't connect, it's not 2 and 2 is 4. 2 and 1 is not 4. It's just obvious. So the Rambam says HaKadosh Baruch Hu's existence is obvious. It's not something you accept. Rambam is a rationalist. You don't accept anything. The Rambam says you don't believe what people tell you. Everything should be scientific. And it's so interesting, Tam tiyam Hashem Elokecha, how do we translate that? Trusting, wholesome. Rambam says Tam means be wise, be smart, use wisdom. Okay, that's the Rambam's approach. Now look at the Rambam, the first Makar, you saw the Yisro of the Chachma, Leida, to know that HaKadosh Baruch Hu exists, not to believe. And look at the second Makar, also you saw the Torah, V'diyas Tavazeh. Now you're absolutely right that in certain writings, like, come with me to the end of this page here, and here. Again, don't feel the need to go through all this. You're not going to go through all this, why should you? But I want you to travel with me to the Sefer HaMitzvahs. It's the 4th page, the 14th Makar, where the Ram talks about a relationship with the Kadosh Baruch Hu, and there he uses the term Amunah. Mitzvah Rishona hi atziva shetzivanu laham, and we're supposed to believe in a Kadosh Baruch Hu. Well, Ram says it's supposed to be scientific. You're supposed to know. Here he says you're supposed to believe. So Reb Chaim Heller was a great guy. Reb Chaim Heller, he was a great guy. He wrote an authoritative. Maybe there was a connection from Yom Tov was much earlier. Teisef Yantif. Could be it was the same family, but he was a great guy. And he was actually in Berlin before the war. You had all these smart people who went there. Lubavitch Rebbe, Rabbi Yeshaber, Rav Hutner, he was one of them, part of that group of, and he got out in time, thank God. And he wrote authoritative translation of the Rambam on Sefer HaMitzvos, and he explained. So he writes something very simple. He says almost everything the Rambam wrote, he wrote in Arabic. The Rambam wrote very little in Lashon HaKodesh. He wrote the Yad in Lashon HaKodesh. Everything else was written in Arabic, including the Sefer HaMitzvahs. When you translate, you can't ever translate well. Anyone here speak 2 or 3 languages? Anyone speak Hebrew or Yiddish well? Grow up? You can't. Certain things don't translate well. You could sort of translate. So he checked the Rambam in the original Arabic in which Sefer HaMitzvahs was written. The Arabic there, the Rambam says, is a mitzvah, itaked, to believe in the Kadosh Baruch Hu. But itaked is a funny word. It doesn't mean believe and it doesn't mean know. It's an Arabic word that is sort of an amalgamation of the 2 words. It's a mistranslation. Even in Sefer HaMitzvahs, the Rambam says you have to know that a Kadosh Baruch Hu exists. You're not supposed to believe. Because everyone believes, including suicide bombers in Gaza. Belief doesn't get you anywhere good. Just repeating what someone told you. Everyone believes, what someone told them. You have to know. And the Rambam says this also in Sefer HaMitzvah. So this is really the Rambam's approach. The major question though is, how could you prove that HaKadosh Baruch Hu exists? So I got to tell you, it's sort of obvious. So the starting point would be, I want you to come with me to source 7. So anyone a native Hebrew speaker here? Any Israelis? Not one Israeli in Scheiner's late at night? So anyone read the Israeli papers online? Yeah. So which is the Israeli paper that is so, I don't want to say anti-Semitic, but so crazy left? Haaretz. Haaretz is crazy.
Jerusalem Post also.
But Haaretz is another plant. I was just reading them, right? Trump is coming. We should talk politics because we have different readings. So Trump is coming out of left field. He really means that he wants to take the Palestinians out of Gaza. He's not talking about killing them. He's not talking about concentration camps. It's just not working. They had a land. All they do is throw rockets at us. This has been tried many, many times. So he, as an American, is saying, this is what I want to do. This could be a solution. Jerusalem Post is, and no one is not criticizing him. Haaretz is writing about him. He's a Nazi. But they're doing it for you. I mean, he's not doing it for him. They're so far left that they're beyond, always. And if you read them, it's important to know. You'll never see a piece that's positive about Israel. It's about the Palestinians.
They care more about the people in Gaza.
They do, but it's their kids. I mean, their kids serve in Gaza. It's crazy. Their kids do serve. I mean, they're living in Israel. But they're so caught up in a fake narrative. They convince themselves that, we Jews don't have a right to live in Israel. I think they really believe that. I think they really what?
Leave.
Yeah, but
They do.
So,
That's what's happening now.
but most are, whatever, I can't. But so Haaretz is so far left. Haaretz is, forget being pro-religious. It's really not pro-Jewish identity. Like everything, Kashrus is no good, and Shabbos is no good, and religious education is no good, and nothing traditional Jewish is good. They published a survey in 2012, and the numbers are vastly higher. And it's Haaretz, so they're not going to push things in the positive direction. They pointed out, what percentage of Jews in Eretz Yisrael believe that a Kadosh Baruch Hu exists? What would you say?
I'm hoping like 75.
80,
You would say 75, 80, 90, right?
I'm hoping.
It's not. There's a lot that are not.
That just believe in God. Believe in God.
Not that are sharing
What would you
mitzvahs,
say?
but Believe in God.
Believe in God.
40.
You'd say 40. What would you say? So Haaretz put their number at probably around 95%. They did a poll. The poll in 2012. Let me share it because I'm adjusting it. The Haaretz, because they couldn't, and if Haaretz is publishing it, they're not pushing it. According to poll, 80% of Israeli Jews believed in God. But let me explain. Israel has, there are many, many people who immigrated from the former Soviet Union. I used to go to Russia to teach. So I know the culture. About 1 million Jews there have come from the former Soviet Union. They grew up, the people who grew up there have no exposure to religion. They don't know. I mean,
Most of them are not Jews. They had a recent account they weren't really Jews.
many aren't Jews, but even those Jews, I saw them, it's hard to really understand what a Tinnik Shenishba is until you interact with people like this. It's
not now.
Right.
Not today, it's a
No,
10
but I'm just saying, many, close to 1 million came. They grew up with absolutely no understanding of what God is. And their children grow up in their homes, and they grow up in communities of people like them. So when they took the statistic, they included them. You take that section out of the population, more than 90% of Israeli Jews admit to believing in God. That was 2012. Every year it goes up. In the 40s it was much lower, 50s it was high, 60s, 70s, goes up every year. Before the war in Poland it was bad, it was much worse.
It's interesting because on social media, one of the big anti-Semitic things is that most of Israelis are atheists anyways. So
It's
why
a
do they
lie.
care about this land?
It's a total lie. It's a total. Now, Haaretz points out, and they're not doing it because they want to encourage religion, but there's nothing they can do. They can't. Then they did statistics about how people in Israel live. 2/3 of Israelis are careful about basar b'cholov. Now, could be they're not makbid the way you and I are. Separate dishes and 6 hours.
Careful meaning careful not to eat it, right?
They don't eat basar b'cholov together. So I'm sure many of them are makbid, but 2/3. And that includes the Russian immigrants. So it's probably like 70, 80%. Like 95% fast in Yom Kippur. So you have some elderly people who can't, who are sick, or maybe are part of it. They're much more traditional than they ever were. Much more traditional than they were in Poland before the war. Certainly more than Lithuania before the war, than Hungary before the war. What's going on? So Haaretz just gives you these numbers that boggle the mind. So I'll tell you what's going on. So there's a whole range of people, right? Muncie goes all the way from, the Turei Karta to Mizrahi, and all types of people floating on Scheiners, right? And they're all Erlachim, right?
It's not the Turei Karta here.
Whatever, I'm just saying there's all types of...
Miners or
oh,
Muncie?
Just saying there's a.
Muncie, I said Muncie. Muncie, you got everything. Muncie, you got everything.
Come and they kick them out.
Right, now let's try to understand. You have, now you could, whatever your attitude towards the Israeli government is, you have the only place in the world where people used to live in their land, they were kicked out of their land, and they came back to their land. You never had this. You had lots of people who were kicked out of their lands, right? Every nation in the world has been kicked out of its land. The only people in the world that was kicked out of its land that came back to its land is Klal Yisrael. So, again, Mizrachist, Agudas, be what you want. But this, something like this has never ever happened in world history.
Recently, you're talking about bringing back recently?
Jews have come back.
So there's a sefer, it's a Haggadah, that what's his name, with a kuf, he's famous, I forgot the name. He shows
Kasher?
this- Yes.
Menachem Kasher.
Menachem Kasher.
So
correct.
Menachem Kasher was the Rosh Yeshiva of Ger. The Ger Rebbe sent him from Poland in 1925 to be the Rosh Yeshiva of Sfas Emes. He went to Eretz Yisrael. He really bought into the situation there, and he actually published a letter from 1947 with signatures of the big Litvische Gedolim, all signing a statement that the establishment of Israel is Reishis Smichas Gula Seder. So that's a whole separate discussion. I don't want to go there. You can find it online. Rabbi Nachman Kasher collected it. So could be some people changed their mind. Could be there was politics, but it's there. So but Menachem Kasher was the founder of the Geri Yeshiva in Eretz Yisrael. But I want to get back to this. Then not only is this the only place in the world where it happened, the Torah tells you it's going to happen. Now, no one is saying, I'm not saying Mashiach is there. I'm not, but the idea that people who were kicked out of the land came back to the land, and the Torah tells you this is going to happen before they were kicked out of the land. There are nevuos in the Teichacha that you're going to be thrown out, and then there are nevuos that you're going to come back, and it's going to be al kanfi nesharim from all over the world. So these Israeli people see these things happening in front of their eyes. To them, it creates emunah. They see the Torah coming true. Israel and Zionism, that became really complicated, right? Because just, the Zionists, a lot of people are uncomfortable. But when people talk about the Holocaust and the suffering, they say, well, why is this happening? We don't know why it happened, but they say there are nevuos in the Torah that Klal Yisrael, you have a special relationship with the Kadosh Baruch Hu, and part of the relationship is that there are going to be terrible difficulties that just strike you. And there have been terrible difficulties that have just struck up. Everyone who looks at the Holocaust, or Khmelnytskis, or the Crusaders, says, there's teichas, so that's, HaKadosh Baruch Hu told us this is going to happen. And it's true, right? We're not explaining why it happened, why HaKadosh Baruch Hu runs the world the way he does. Lots of people, we suffered more, but lots of people have suffered. And there have been lots of people who have been annihilated, and maybe nothing like the Holocaust. No country in the world ever had such a thing where they were expelled from their land, and then they came back to the land. So if you can see Yad Hashem in the suffering, maybe you can see Yad Hashem in people coming back to Eretz Yisrael. So I'm not saying it's Mashiach or it isn't Mashiach. I don't want anyone to go ahead and burn signs outside my house. But I am saying is if you can see Yad Hashem in suffering, what other people have also suffered, right? The Tutsis were killed and the Armenians were killed, millions of them. Maybe you can see Yad Hashem is something that never ever happened to anyone else in the entire world. And it's not just coming back to Eretz Yisrael. I actually bring it down here. I'm doing this for a few years now, so I might as well make it interesting, right? Otherwise it just gets boring, right? Keep it boring and make it interesting, you tell me.
Spice it up.
Spice it up a little bit. So again, I didn't prepare this for Scheiners. I do these scholarships. So at the hotel, right? I go to hotels sometimes, so people like classes there, right? So they like it spiced up. So I want to show you, I think I have it here. There's an article from the Jerusalem Post. Jerusalem Post is not religious. And it's an article by a fellow named 10, source, page 4, source 10. Source, yeah, on your sheet says, source 10, page 4. It's by a fellow named Daniel Ben Sadon. Totally fry, and he says he's an atheist. There's very few atheists in Israel, but he's one of the 2 atheists left in Israel. He's the Kaifer Baker, the real McCoy, and he's a professor, right? The best type of Kaifer is a professor, because then he's a professor at Hebrew University, and he's a professor of language. So, this is not the type of guy who's davening, who's going to the daf in the morning, right? So he's an absolute kaifer and he studies language. And he says something interesting. He says, there have been lots of languages in the world. Languages come and go. and ancient languages, right? So, I don't know, the Amud Yemi, we're learning Megillah now, right? So anyone looking for an Amud Chevra? We have a nice little Amud Shir. Am I allowed to? No, talk to me about it. What?
Throw a plug, no?
What? Okay, I just did. Lots of languages. Aramaic and Chaldean and Assyrian. Does anyone speak these languages today? Sure. Not so many. And a lot of these languages fell into disuse. Have any of these languages been resurrected? Can you artificially resurrect a language? So, anyone like history here? Anyone know anything about Esperanza? Anyone from high school? Esperanto or Esperanza? So Esperanto was, he was a Jewish guy, right? The guy who found, everyone crazy is Jewish. So, right. So there was a fellow, I don't know his name, I don't know how many, about 150 years ago, who said, it's a crazy thing that there's so many different languages, and languages are so complicated. Let's make one simple language that everyone understands, that's easy to teach, and what you'll do is you'll save gazillions of trillions of dollars, because when a language is simple and short, you spend less time talking, less time writing, less time communicating, you can accomplish more. You know, Israelis accomplish more than they do. They're becoming richer and richer because Hebrew is a short language. You can accomplish more in a memo than you can in English. French is longer than English. French are less productive because of it. That's part of it. But Esperanto was and everyone speak the same language. There would be no wars. Did it work? It never works, because languages, you can't force a language. What's the one ancient language that resurrected itself? Lashon HaKodesh. Now, you want to say... it's the same.
It was never lost.
It was never a spoken language.
Right.
It was, but there are people study Latin in the churches. They read ancient Latin, and there are people in corners of Spain who study their old Basque language, but they're not spoken.
But it wasn't a spoken language before. It could be
Hebrew was spoken. What do we speak in Eretz Yisrael? Spoken language.
No. What?
What do we speak? We spoke Hebrew.
They
They spoke Hebrew. Now, is modern Hebrew exactly like ancient Israel? Again, no one is burning Israeli flags, so we're not going to go there. But it's sort of the same, right? Ancient. You look at Shakespeare. Current English is not exactly like ancient English, but it's English, right? Current Hebrew is not exactly. So this Apikoros, who is a professor of philosophy, who was the one atheist left in Israel, says, I study language, and he says, ultimately, I wanted to see his language. The process of Hebrew's return to regular usage was unique. There are no other examples of a sacred language becoming a national language. So he says, I'm a scientist, I study language. I don't know, I'm going to stay in Apikoros, because if you're in Apikoros, you don't have to fast in Yom Kippur, you don't have to make a bracha, and you can do all types of things. But at the end of the day, I can't explain how Hebrew came back into being. So we see Yad Hashem in Holocaust and Crusades and in the Inquisition. And other nations have suffered, maybe not as much as us, but plenty of other nations have suffered. The resurrection of Israel, the resurrection of Hebrew, was something that never ever happened. If you have a kid who is grappling with Amunah and he isn't sure, you got something you can show that kid that really is very convincing, and it's really to get around. And the Rambam tells us your Yiddishkeit is not supposed to be based on the fact that your parents told you that, because the Zulu in Africa is told by his parent, the Hamas terrorist is told by his parent. Some of them have smart parents, some of them have smart religious teachers, they have churches and mosques, and some of them are very anti-Semitic, but they have very convincing, charismatic leaders. So simply believing is not what the Torah wants, because everyone does. Torah wants more. But where is the empirical knowledge? Well, empirical knowledge is the truth of the Torah. You have a Torah that tells you you're going to go back to Eretz Yisrael. You have a Torah that tells you you're going to live in Eretz Yisrael when such a thing is impossible to imagine. Torah tells you you're going to suffer like no other people. That has happened. The Torah tells you you'll have a language that will resurrect itself. It doesn't say it in so many words, but it seems to say that. So these are things that you don't see anywhere else in the world. Now again, if you have no problems with Amunah, your kid is going to a fine cheder and there are no issues, maybe keep it simple. Maybe it'll work. I'm not saying you should complicate things, but I'll tell you, I spent a lot of time with young people in town, and it's complicated in a lot of their minds. It's not simple for a lot of them. And here, you have something that no one else has ever seen. Is it Mashiach? I'm not saying it's Mashiach. But you do have the beginning of fulfillments of what HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells us. And truth be told, you'll tell me that the early Zionists weren't religious. Many weren't, some were. Many actually were. Mizrahi was part of it. But even if they weren't religious, who built the second Bais Medrash? Who got the second Bais Medrash going? Koresh, a guy. So maybe Esther was Jewish, but he acted like a guy. And the Medrash says, well, why did Kadosh Baruch Hu ask a guy to build the second Bais?
They destroyed it, and now they're rebuilding it. They destroyed it by the Bais Scheiner, the Batusim, they made all the tzoras.
Well, it wasn't Kairosh, it wasn't the Persians. That was the second. Kairosh is they destroyed the second Bais Hamikdash. Right, that's the second Bais Hamikdash. So I'm talking about the building of the second Bais Hamikdash. It was Kairosh, a guy got it going. And the Medrash says, why did Kadosh Baruch Hu ask a guy to do it? The Medrash says, I don't know. And Goyim were involved in the first Bais Hamikdash. Shlomo was involved. Shlomo Melech is Chiram from Tzur. But why? So the Medrash, who does? What?
Yeshaya said the Kodesh will build it.
Right, but the Medrash says, why are you involved in Goyim? The Medrash asks, why is the Kadosh Baruch Hu involved in Goyim? The Medrash says, I don't know, but that's what Kadosh Baruch Hu wants. Right, so it's true it's coming from Yeshaya. It's true that Shlomo Melech is Chiram. But why? Why come out to outside forces when you have good Erlich Eden who will go ahead and build an altar as a Gaidish? I don't know why. Medrash doesn't know why. But I'm just saying, so that secular people were involved. I don't know that it's a Rabbi. I'm just telling you, you start with the Ram. The Rambam says, you're not supposed to believe.
Some part of Kedusha.
Maybe HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants them to feel Kedusha. Maybe they'll come close. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has his reasons. HaKadosh Baruch Hu has his reasons. But you have something that you've never ever seen. So you have a Rambam saying you have to see Hashem. Well, how do you see Hashem? Well, let's start. To live as a from Jew, you need the Torah. How do you see the Torah is true? There are nevuos. There are nevuos of Churban that have struck in ways that are unseen elsewhere. But there are nevuos of Yeshua that you don't see elsewhere either. And I'll tell you, people say it's harder to be a Maimon than it once was. It's not true. I think it's easier to be a Maimon. Once upon a time, maybe it was easier to be a Kafir. You could say, I don't know, people, the world came into being by itself. So you could imagine, it just happened by itself. Can you imagine that the world would come into being by itself? Just a simple body, right? Once upon a time, people could imagine that a body was something that was uncomplicated. How many molecules does a body have?
Trillions.
It's octillions, actually. I think 8 octillion. So that's trillions of trillions. You take the tiniest atom, and you try splitting the atom. What happens?
An enormous billion.
You have an atomic explosion. So the tiniest atom is so complicated that you split it, you have an atomic explosion. So 200 years ago, when people didn't know about this, maybe they could imagine that such things came into being by themselves. Can a sensible person imagine that such a thing could come into being by itself? And so you see that there's HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the creation of the world, because maybe hundreds of years ago people could have imagined the world coming into being of itself. It's unimaginable now. It's impossible for anyone sensible to imagine that the world came into being by itself, which is why most scientists, when they're polled, believe in God. Most scientists. Not most, I won't say all, but some of them are partisan or funny. Most believe in God. And then you take it to the next step. You go to Eretz Yisrael, the vast majority believe in God, and don't just believe in God in some esoteric way, believe in God in which they live with some level of frumkeit. 2/3 are keeping Basar B'chal, but it's more now. Now again, exactly, I don't know if it's exactly, but enough that it's not just some idea, some vague idea that's floating around their minds, and it's displaying itself in a practical way. So when I gave this lecture at the hotel, I think I gave this. So the title that I called it was, again, the death of God. What is that based on? It's a little bit of a disconcerting title, makes people nervous a little bit, but it's good to make people nervous because then something happens, right? If you're not nervous, you just sit and eat. Okay? So I want you to see, come with me to page 2 and look at the bottom of the page, source 8. So the death of God is a book, and it's written by a guy who's called Alistair McRae. He's actually one of the most accomplished people in the world. Probably one of the best universities in the world, maybe the best, the most selective is Oxford, right? Certainly up there. He's a professor of theology at Oxford. That means he's probably one of the world's leading experts in theology. He's not Jewish, he's not partisan. I don't know that he practices religion in a normal way. But he explains that you go back 200 years ago, and again, I don't know how many students of history here, anyone 18th century, Voltaire, people like that, But it was fashionable then not to believe in God. In the 1800s, most people, if you would have asked them, would have said they don't believe in God. In the Christian world and the Jews, it was very fashionable not to believe in God, because people didn't realize how complicated man is. So you can imagine man evolving out of, by himself. With the passage of time, and as scientific knowledge has grown, it's become harder and harder to not believe in God. You can't, it's impossible to say that an atom evolved. We realize how complex it is. So he called his book The Death of God as a statement that modern man has to believe in God. It's just too obvious. This is a guy. He's not a from Jew. I don't know that he's living as a religious Christian either. But he says, you can't not believe in God. God is so obvious that you have to believe in him. So, again, that's God in a broad way. Now, whether you'll believe in a God and be a Muslim or a Christian or a Jew, that's another discussion. But for us as Jews, it's actually really not hard to take to the next level. What is the next level? The Torah that we have, and again, that's the beauty of archaeology. People are scared of archaeology, but what do archaeologists do? Archaeologists find old things that prove that everything the Torah says is absolutely true. That's what they generally do. Also, once upon a time, the archaeologists that led excavations in Israel and other places were anti-religious. But the more archaeologists engage in archaeology, the more religious they become. I'm trying to remember the most famous archaeologist who practiced in Israel in the early 20th century. I don't remember his name. But he went to Israel as someone who didn't believe in the Torah. He left after decades in archaeology, said the Torah is true, because you just see that you find archaeological evidence. So, anyone see the Dead Sea Scrolls in Israel, in the Israel Museum? So the Dead Sea Scrolls, there's no question, were written before the Churban of the second Bais Medrash. Every scientist, the biggest epicurus, will accept that. They date it with carbon. They date it in many, many ways. So there's no question that it exists before before the Churban of the second Bais Medrash. Now, if you'll say the Torah is just some fake, people used to say this, right? That was written by a bunch of crazy people. People did say that, right? Then if you write a fake document, then you're going to write a fake document that will have currency that people will subscribe to. So if I'm trying to have you buy into a fake business deal, I'm going to try to put down a business deal that's going to make sense, that's going to convince you. The Torah writes things that are impossible to believe. We're still living in Eretz Yisrael. Things are still established. Things are still strong. The Torah says you're going to go into Galus. You're going to suffer like no other people that ever existed. The Torah tells you you will go from land to land. You're not going to find a resting place like no other people. You'll wander the world from place to place. And then HaKadosh Baruch Hu will gather you from all four corners of the world back to Eretz Yisrael. If the Torah was written by people who were just trying to create a fake document, why write crazy things that never happen? Because people have suffered, but the Torah is saying that you'll suffer more than any other people. Why are you predicting that? No one has ever come back to their ancient land. No languages has been resurrected. But if the Torah was written by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, then HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows what the future is going to bring. So, the fact that you have Dead Sea Scrolls that you know for sure that Apikarsim, secular people, all Goyim admit it's absolutely clear.
What exactly is the Dead Sea Scrolls?
Dead Sea Scrolls were scrolls that were found near the Dead Sea that are the full text of the Torah, many other Kisvei HaKodesh, that we know were written well before the Churban of the Bais Medrash. By Jews, actually by a breakaway sect called the Essenes. They weren't the best of Jews. There was a breakaway sect, but Jews who are, we had troublemakers then, but the document, it's the text of the Torah. It was preserved in a community of people who weren't sure what Torah mitzvahs the way we are. Essenes, they were, and more. Yeshaya, yeah. But it's the text of our Torah. It's the words of our Torah. And it has all the things the Torah says that just don't make sense if you're writing a document that you're trying to pass off as a fake document. So it's not just that the Torah's nevuos have come true. We know the Torah was in place. Secular people will admit that it was in place before the Churban of the second Bais Medrash. So, when the Rambam tells us, you have to not believe in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You have to live with knowledge of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You have to be able to prove it to yourself. You can. And it's easier than it ever was. Now we can ask ourselves why HaKadosh Baruch Hu made it easier. Eretz Yisrael makes it easier, the resurrection of Hebrew makes it easier, archaeological findings make it easier, maybe science makes it easier. Ancient man could imagine that man came into being by himself. A modern scientist who's honest to himself can't envision man evolving by himself. Now, you could say that would be another discussion. Did HaKadosh Baruch Hu create man in 1 minute? Could you accept the idea that HaKadosh Baruch Hu guided evolution over many years? That would be another discussion. But to say that this idea of a universe, of man coming into being without HaKadosh Baruch Hu, without some God force guiding it, is impossible to accept scientifically. It doesn't make sense. So in many ways, it's easier to be a Maimon than it was, which is why more people in Israel believe in today than 10 years ago, than 20 years ago, than people before World War II. Poland before World War II was less religious than Israel is now. The percentage of people who kept kosher was lower than it is in Israel today. It's people misconstrue the situation. Why are people becoming more religious?
See facts.
Because they see facts in front of their eyes. They see Israel. They see science. They see archaeology that proves you can work. And I'll tell you, for the kids today, it helps them. I taught you, daughter. It helps the kids today when you bring this in, because in some ways it's harder to be religious because it's more tempting. The world is more accepting. 100 years ago, Jews couldn't intermarry because no non-Jew would marry them. They can intermarry now with all the anti-Semitism. Right, 100 years ago, it was harder for Jews to sort of become accepted into secular society. It's not so hard today. So in some ways, there's a great threat of assimilation. Well, how does HaKadosh Baruch Hu counter that? HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave us advances that actually make it easier to be a Maimon. And the truth is, it's so obvious that even Goyim subscribe. So here, if you go to source 9, it's actually a dispiriting survey. It's actually a terrible survey, but it's true. It talks about North American Jews. It talks about Jews in Eretz Yisrael. The situation in Eretz Yisrael is so much better than the situation in North America. Jews there, 90% believe in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Almost everyone fasts on Yom Kippur. Almost no one intermarries, partly because there's no one to intermarry with. 2% intermarry, 1%, but nothing. Here in North America, it's a churban. Intermarriage is 80%. Jews, secular Jews, know nothing. And secular Jews are so conflicted that not only do they know nothing, they're actually less supportive of Judaism. They believe in HaKadosh Baruch Hu less. They're actually less supportive of Israel than non-Jews. Israel's biggest supporters in North America, they're not secular Jews. It's the small frum community and it's the Christians. Secular Jews are at Tzara because they're so conflicted, they're so mixed up inside. So Pew Research, the biggest research company in the country, I think, the most authoritative, asked people in the street a simple question. And it said, it's 2000, well, this is actually back in 2012, it's many years ago. It's only advanced. Israel it's amazing, right? It started with 600,000 people. It's 10 million now. It started someplace totally poor. It's one of the wealthiest countries in the world. No one expected Israel to be founded, and interestingly enough, no one expected Israel to survive. The CIA issued a directive in 1949. Israel might be founded, but it has no chance of surviving. Like, how can it survive? 600,000 people who came from all over the world, who didn't speak one language, who had no trained army, surrounded by more than 100 million Arabs with trained armies. No one expected it to survive. Indeed, some people say that many of the countries that voted for the founding of Israel, there was a UN vote. Many of these countries were anti-Semitic. Why did they vote for the founding of Israel? Because they were convinced that Israel would be founded. What would happen next? The Arabs would wage war and they'll all be killed. So they voted for Israel as a way of destroying Israel. And I'll tell you, from the opposite direction, Aguda was against the founding of Israel in 1947. And why were they against? They said it's suicide. It's not going to survive. Aguda came out with a proclamation. So, it was coming from a good place of concern. It was a mistake, but it was coming from a place of concern. So no one expected Israel to survive. It's unimaginable that it survived. But it did, and it became prosperous, and it's gradually becoming more and more religious. Just look at the government. More and more of the ministers are religious. All types of religion, Haredi, Mizrahi, but more and more people are living with religion in Israel. You see, every second person in government now is wearing yarmulke. It really, things have changed a lot. So people look at Israel. The pollsters ask them, you look at Israel, do you believe this is coming from God? Was Israel given to the Jewish people by God? So this question was asked of Christians. Okay. Now again, you ask it from Muslims, they're anti-Jewish. You ask it from Buddhists or from people who come from India that don't know anything about Israel. It's a different planet. But Christians have some exposure, and you ask it to an evangelical Christians, they're ones who study the Bible who know it. So what percentage of them do you think? Now, again, you got to be careful. The black community, there's tension. So ask white evangelical Christians, what percentage see Israel as being something given to Israel, to the Jews by God? Now understand, for a goy to say that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave Israel to the Jews, what is he admitting? He's admitting defeat. Because what was Christian theology for almost 2,000 years? That HaKadosh Baruch Hu rejected us, right? Yashka, what is their core belief? That the Jews were rejected, they were thrown out of Israel because of that. They're never going to go back to Israel unless they accept Yashka. There's a new religion that HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So the whole religion was based on the idea that HaKadosh Baruch Hu rejected us by throwing us out of Israel.
And then what we're saying in Shema, and it's in the Chumash, if we don't belong in Israel, then the land is not producing anything.
That's another proof that the land wasn't productive when we went
Even
there.
before the war,
That
look at what we
absolutely
stand and look at
right.
our lovely cousins.
So for a guy, a Christian, to say that we're in Israel now because God wants us there, he almost has to like repudiate his religion.
Evangelicals hold that by supporting Israel, it's good for them.
But that's a whole complicated regulation. That's like a mechiras chametz, because me'ikra din, their basic ashkafa is that we were thrown out of Israel because God rejected us. So we're in Israel. They have to find a solution, right? We have to deal with chametz and pesach. We have mechiras chametz. We have to deal with shmita. We have prusbul. They have the same aterim. They have to deal with the Jews who are in Israel. So they created some kakememi svara that if we all go to Israel, then we'll all accept yashka, because they have nothing to do to say. But it really goes against the core belief. Right, so they're sort of stuck. So they created this like crazy theology that doesn't make sense. So, but I'm just saying the idea that God gives us Israel is a complete reversal. It's a complete repudiation of everything that they were taught for more than 1,000 years. So what percentage of these Christians believe that God gave us Israel, that God wants us in Israel now? What do you think? What percentage?
Almost all.
82%. Because you can't argue. Now, ledavoni, what percentage of Jews believe that God gave Israel to the Jewish people? What percentage? Among Christians, it's 82%. Among Jews in North America, what percentage is it?
81.
40. Only 40. And you know why it's 40%? Look at the numbers. Jews by religion, 40. The Orthodox, it's 84%, right? Among the ultra-Orthodox, it's 81. Among the modern Orthodox, it's 90. But among the Reform, it's 35. They're just like so mixed up. They're the ones that are joining the Gaza protest. They hate...
Modern Orthodox is higher than ultra-Orthodox.
Well, yeah, there's stronger Zionism there. You know. I mean, you know that, right? I mean, that's just the way...
That's interesting.
Yeah. So what's interesting is that the Jews in North America are just so mixed up and so conflicted that you see Yad Hashem and you're just rejecting it. But Goyim see it and it's obvious to them, even though it completely destroys their theology.
That's interesting.
That's where the Muslims
White and evangelical,
Jews
82%.
coming back.
Yeah.
That's why they hate. That's why they can't stand.
Yeah.
They want to get rid of the Jews because
Right.
the Jews come back. Muhammad's religion. It says in the Quran.
Right.
They come back.
Yeah.
The whole
So
religion becomes.
right over battle.
The
So
funny
Christians.
thing is that in the Muslim religion, supposedly the Quran says that it is our land, that it does belong to us, which means they go against their own.
Right,
They
right.
go against their own Bible.
Right. So Islam, interestingly enough, is really in a typical place because their land isn't Israel. Their land is Mecca, is Medina, is there. So Israel isn't holy to them. So the whole thing is a little bit crazy. And Islam wasn't started by a Jew. Yashka was a Jew. Muhammad was not a Jew. So it really
Probably a Jew somehow.
could be. Anyone could be. He tried to win over the Jews in the beginning, but it didn't. Yeah. Okay, so but there's more Makairis. I mean, but it's a discussion.